Excellent. Okay, so without further ado, I think we'll move on to our presentation here that most of us are here for. So introduce Tom Reid as a Viva member and has, along with his co-op, they together have gone through the process, and Tom went through all the steps with his group, and is one of the first I know to be successful in getting the place EV ready and having the chargers actually installed. He'll give us a complete rundown of the state of where they're at in his presentation tonight. So we appreciate him coming here and sharing the knowledge he's gained by going through the process with us. So thanks, Tom, and take it away.
All right, thank you. I'll share this. Okay, and I apologize in advance because all the people who know a lot about what I'm about to describe, but hopefully not everyone will know everything about it. Our building, our strata building, is out at UBC. We are not in the city of Vancouver, so we have a different set of jurisdictional controls, different building permit process, for example. It's all done not under the city of Vancouver guidelines, but under different guidelines. Our building's about 17 years old. 7 stories, sort of a moderate size, I guess, 42 suites. We have 73 parking stalls for the 42 suites. All of them are underground. We have visitor parking, but it's out on the street, not underground. We had a 5-member strata council, and everyone was involved in the decision process that we went through to get EV charging installed. We have about 6 EVs and hybrids, so it's not like there was an enormous demand for it, but obviously there was some demand for it. And in particular, we had one Tesla owner who had campaigned frequently for us to look at getting EV charging somehow. So we sort of looked at 3 options. One was plug it in now. Some people we had allowed to get trickle charges while we looked at this. So they used the 120 volt outlets. We had a couple of breaker incidences, so we were happy when we didn't have to do that. But in our existing breaker box, we have room for 5 level 2 chargers. So the question is, well, why don't 5 owners just run a cable from their parking stall to the existing breaker box? Well, there's one concern is that it really favors those who are very close to the electrical room and penalizes those who are way at the far end of the parking lot. So it's not being treated exactly equally there. But a much bigger problem is that whoever comes along 6th is facing an enormous expansion cost because they're going to have to put in a lot of heavy infrastructure, and obviously that's not going to happen. How could it happen? Well, I suppose when the 6th person came along, council could go back to council and say, let's vote on putting in universal charging, which brings about a little problem. The 5 who have already connected really wouldn't have any particular gain by voting yes on a plan to put in universal charging. After all, they've already got theirs. So we really felt that if this was the route we went, it's a really short-term solution. Option 2, what about putting in a shared charger or chargers? And we know that a lot of buildings have done this, and you know, in some cases it may be the only or by far the best option. And it kind of a lower installation cost than universal charging. And I know there are some hydro rebates that would be available. But we have a particular problem. When I mentioned that we have 73 parking stalls for the residents, all underground and no visitor parking, we wouldn't have a spot for a single shared or a double shared charger. And even worse, it's very hard for us to actually create a spot. We would actually have to get rezoning permission to create a spot. And it turns out that in our garage, there really isn't a very good spot to put it, even if we could get permission to do so. We were also a little bit worried about wait times and potential conflicts. You know, people are supposed to move their cars on time, and maybe they wouldn't. But the big issue, big problem with this one was the inability to find a spot. So the third one, which is the one we went with, is to find a way to put in infrastructure charging for everyone. We install all of the infrastructure needed, but not the charges. We leave that up to each individual owner. Some of them would decide to get a charger right away. Others may never decide to get a charger. Obviously, this for us was a longer term and more efficient solution because more people could charge at the same time than with a shared one. There are current rebates administered through BC Hydro. They're actually from the province, a little bit from the feds, but Hydro is the administrator of that. So that could reduce the burden. This solution would treat all owners equally. So it didn't matter where you were, where your parking spot is in the garage. You don't face a penalty because you're far away or a gain because you happen to be close. And as it turns out, we had the electrical capacity to do this. So when we looked at all the factors, we thought, boy, by far, that's really what we should be doing. So our plan has two parts. The first one is infrastructure. That's the benefit to everyone. Everything but the chargers. For us, it was the subservice, a new meter, conduits, junction boxes for all stalls. We went with 3-to-1 sharing, so it meant we need 14 circuits because we have 42 owners. 3 times 14 will give us the 42. Each of those circuits is a 40-amp circuit. We would need a new Wi-Fi throughout the garage, and all 42 owners would share in the cost equally, and the works would be owned, all these infrastructure works would be owned by the strata, not by individuals. So the second part is the chargers. And the idea was to allow everyone the opportunity, if they want, to put in a level 2 charger, 208 volt, 30-amp charger. They'd be networked, hence the Wi-Fi and the Wi-Fi boosters we had put in. You don't have to get a charger. If you want one, you can buy it at your own choice. Everyone pays for their own, so there are no subsidies for anyone getting a charger. You're only allowed one charger, even though you may have 2 stalls. Council has to approve all the chargers, and the chargers belong to the owner. So here's sort of what one of the things looks like. We had a lot of room, or we had enough wall space in our electrical room for all that new equipment you see on the left. And that involves also a new meter. So all the EV charging that we put in goes through this one meter. Typical charger, well, in this case, this owner has 2 stalls. The owner happens to be me, in fact. Up at the top, you'll see a junction box. If you look very carefully to the right, you can see the conduit that feeds it. And of course, there's actually the charger itself because we opted to get a charger at the very start. Here's what we were telling our owners on the lead up to the vote to approve this whole plan. One of them was that it will increase property values. And yes, you can argue that no one knows exactly how much you'd increase property values, at least not without a pretty big study. But it stands to reason that they couldn't possibly hurt property values. We felt it would be better to do this under our own initiative and by our choice, rather than have it done by edict. There is a chance, I have no idea what the odds are, but there is a chance at some point that local government will institute some sort of requirement that buildings like ours provide level 2 or level 3 charging. So we thought, well, rather than wait and be told what we have to do, let's go ahead and do it now. We told the owners as well that we think we get rebates for this. And those rebates, may not be around forever. So we should probably act while we think the chance of getting them is very good. We told owners that voting yes means they get a bit more of a choice when it comes time for a new car. That falls on deaf ears for everyone who just bought a new car that isn't an EV. But a lot of people have cars that may be nearing the end either of their lease or their useful life. And voting yes on this would at least give them an option they didn't have before. We also advised the owners that we thought it was a relatively minor cost. In the end, they would decide whether it was acceptable, but we were pretty sure that by crafting a financial plan, we could get them to vote yes without incurring a very great cost. Something we didn't talk to them about, and which we sort of came upon after the fact, are the potential carbon offset revenues that we might get. So those were really, the first 5 of those were the main selling points that we explained to people. How are we going to pay for that infrastructure? Well, the rebates, the Clean BC Go Electric rebates that are administered through BC Hydro here in the Lower Mainland is one way. We are charging a connection fee per charger. So if you do get a charger, you have to pay a connection fee to us, to the strata. We have a special levy that people voted to approve. We were able to keep that below $1,000 on an average condo. And finally, we'd use some money from the Capital Reserve Fund. So in terms of sort of how slices of the pie went, rebates were the biggest one. They're pending. We haven't actually got them yet. We're optimistic and we've been pre-approved, but they haven't actually arrived yet. The connections that we're asking people who get chargers to pay, there is that special levy. And finally, we're using some from the CRF. The rebates are the three offered under the program: the EV Ready plan, the infrastructure, and the EV charging rebates. So we have been pre-approved for all three of those. Obviously, if we don't get them, we have permission from our owners to use money from the CRF, but we're counting on getting them and are optimistic that we will. The big deal is that that pie chart and the size of the pie works for us, and it might not work for others. And there are a number of reasons for that, which we'll get into in a second. So that was paying for the infrastructure. How do we pay for the chargers? Well, the plan that we came up with, we had 13 owners who signed up right away for a charger, including me. Even though I don't have an EV, it's a little bit cheaper to get it installed while the contractor was here doing all the infrastructure work. There is some rebates available for the chargers. We had arranged a plan whereby the strata bought them from the contractor and sold them to the owners. The price that we sold them includes a connection fee. So it's not just the charger, it's the connection fee. And that the idea of having a connection fee will apply in the future, not just the first 13. Strata gets the hydro rebates or grants if there are any, and that applies to the 13 now, plus ones that are added in the future. Charges will cost a little more in the future, and owners then will simply buy it directly from the contractor rather than from us. And council, of course, must approve whatever future charger is put in there, which obviously right now is going to be the same as the first 13. The reason that we had purchased the chargers from the contractor and sold them to the 13 residents was that guaranteed we could put in one application for the rebates for the chargers. How are we going to pay for hydro? Well, we're not going to do third-party billing. We're going to have the strata itself bill the users. The property manager will bill once or twice a year. We haven't actually worked this totally out with the property manager, but at the moment, it's a very minor task. You may remember we had that separate new meter. Well, we also get a separate new bill from hydro, and because that service is only for EV charging, we'll know exactly what it costs people. The software for each charger tells us how much power they consumed. So if we know the total bill and we know everyone's share, we can work out what their share of the bill is in dollars based on their share of the power they've consumed. If you have a charger like me and don't have an EV like me, then you don't pay for hydro. The only people who are paying are people who actually consume it. We had to go through some bylaw changes. We had to set out owner responsibilities for their charger. We had to set out limitations on usage, not allowing people to run 2 or 3 chargers off their one junction box. Our bylaw set out the fact that we will have connection fees and sets out what happens to the rebates that they accrue to the strata itself, not to individuals. Sets out the responsibility and requirement to pay for user fees. We were able to track down a few sample bylaws that obviously, we ran them by our legal, our lawyer, and I would advise everyone to do the same. I have one more thing that we didn't have to go to the electors on, to our residents on, and that is Section 71 of the Strata Property Act. This deals with whether there's a significant change to community property, because if there is a significant change to community property, then the Strata Council needs 75% approval at an AGM or a special general meeting. Our council took the approach that what we're doing in the parking area does not amount to a significant change. That there are cars there before and cars after. There are junction boxes down there now for other things. There are conduits down there now. So we felt comfortable in saying that we didn't call this a significant change, and we didn't go to the residents to get permission for this use of the common property. Obviously, we had to go to them to borrow the money and to implement the plan. So owner approval. Well, we sent out 2 newsletters before we even decided to proceed to a formal examination of this. We sent out 3 newsletters after we had decided, just to explain the decision that we've made and what the design plan is, what the financing would be. We also offered small group Q&A meetings. We didn't actually have very many people take us up on it, but we thought that would be a good way for groups of 2 or 3 to ask questions without having to go to a special meeting. But we did, of course, have a special meeting in May. Our property manager was great in arranging a really short turnaround time for a special general meeting, which we had to have by Zoom. And at that May meeting, 75% of our owners attended, 30 out of the 42 owners attended that meeting. And ta-da, we got 100% yes approval for the funding and for the bylaw, the 2 questions that were before the owners. Everyone said yes, which surprised us. We thought it might pass, but I don't think we would have thought it would have passed so strongly. Some challenges we did face, choosing a design, and there are an awful lot of options out there you have to go through. It wasn't just a big 3 where we decided not to put in, shared charging or just let people connect to the existing box. But even with the new one, decisions about what charger are you going to go with, how much amperage should you build in if you have to expand the system, what kind of sharing you should have. So there were a few things there. In addition, councils are called upon to compare contractor bids, and that's not always easy. I mean, we're really happy with our contractor, but to get to that point, you do have to go through a fair amount of technical stuff. We had to budget for costs that are not included in the contractor's bid, a whole bunch of other things. Some permits, we have to arrange for the building power outage, for security for that, the BC Hydro meter, a whole bunch of other things that we had to budget for before we could come up with a number to present to owners. We had to find a balance between our reserve fund and a special levy, and that's one that every strata is going to have to face. One big challenge was delays in the supply chain. Our contractor had to wait in many cases for stuff to be delayed, so be delivered. But so it did delay us a bit. And when we were pre-approved for the rebates, BC Hydro said, well, here's the time, let's say a 3-month time window for you to do the work. But because of these supply chain issues, we missed 1 or 2 of those. And Hydro was terrific in giving us an extension. I think they were quite understanding that we were doing our level best to get this done quickly, and that some things were simply flat out beyond our control. So they were really good about accommodating some of those delays. We had to manage a power outage for the whole building for 6 hours, which went remarkably well. I thought that was going to be a pretty testy day, but in fact, it turned out pretty well. And on balance, the day-to-day disruptions for the installation of all this were generally pretty minor. Everybody, the owners were all good about moving their vehicles a bit when they had to leave room for the contractor to get at the wall and whatnot. But I'd have to say that on balance, the disruptions that we faced weren't nearly as bad as I thought they might be at the start. Here's what our timing looked like. It went on for a long time. We did some basic research late in 2019, just talking to contractors, getting some idea of what some of our options might be. We contacted Plug-in BC, which I would advise everyone to do if you're thinking of doing this. They were a great resource in giving us advice on process and on some technical matters. So we went to them in the first half of 2020. We selected a contractor not long after. We had been talking to Plug-in BC. We finalized the plans at the end of 2020. Those red dots you see in there, by the way, are when we send out newsletters to advise the owners what we're doing and what we found so far. So by the end of 2020, we had the plan pretty well finalized. We applied for the hydro rebates right away. We got pre-approval really pretty quickly when you bear in mind how many of these hydro must have to go through. We had our strata meeting in May, which we could, as close to the pre-approval date as we could possibly get it and still meet the requirements of the Strata Property Act. We signed a contract with the contractor in July of 2021, started work just I think a month or so, 2 months later when they got some equipment in, and they just finished the work last month. So all in all, it went, we think, really well. The big thing, and I'm sure some of you are going to say, gosh, can you tell us how much all of this cost? The thing is that every building is going to be different. And what we adopted for our plans and our funding mechanism worked for us, judging by the 100% yes vote. But it obviously wouldn't necessarily work for everyone. For one thing, and there was a comment made just before I started this about the mix of owners, and that is really true. We have friends who live in condos, and the makeup of their owners is very different from ours. And they've looked at putting in EV charging, and they know they're facing a really steep uphill push for some of the people in the building who just are not interested in this. As it turns out, for reasons obviously not in our control, the owners of our building were pretty keen to do this. The electrical capacity varies so much building to building. I mentioned that we had enough basic electrical capacity to put in a whole new subservice, 600 amp subservice, but obviously lots of buildings wouldn't have that. So for them, when they were developing a plan, or when they in the future develop a plan, they're going to have to build in perhaps a lot more capital costs than we did. From building to building, the physical layout varies. I don't know whether ours is more efficient than other ones. It may be more efficient than some and less efficient than others. But if you had a different kind of layout, you may be looking at a different level of costs. The rebates may vary. They're not going to last forever. At least I suspect they're not going to last forever. So if some other building is looking at this a year or 2 years down the road, and they look at our model, it may be that the rebates are worse, or maybe hopefully even better. There's obviously going to be, from building to building, quite a difference in the tolerance for special levy. If your strata building just had 2 special levies for ordinary big repairs, it may well be that the residents are not particularly open to having yet another special levy before them. And the size of that capital reserve fund varies. I don't know any strata that feels they have enough money in their capital reserve fund, but if you had very little in there, you're obviously going to have to rely on other sources, and that for sure is going to be, things like a special levy if you don't get rebates. So those things will really affect the degree to which our model might be transferable to other buildings. Just at the end here, to wrap up some resources, Plug-in BC, so they were really good about giving us advice. We talked to them, I mentioned early, and we talked to them a couple of times during the course of the installation. BC Hydro, they have an EV charging section. They administer those rebates for the province, and they were really good about giving us an extension, recognizing that we just couldn't meet the deadline due to supply chain issues. The biggest resource, probably by far, is the contractor. There's so many technical things that ordinary councils and councillors shouldn't be expected to know about electricity. Most of us know enough to get us killed quickly, and that's about it. So the contractor becomes a really important source of information and help. Viva, well, venues like the one we're at now, where you can find a chat room or attend a meeting like this and learn more about it, is obviously everyone who's here now knows about Viva. So if you're interested in it and you're not a member, you should consider joining. And the Condominium Homeowners Association of BC, they have quite a database of issues and legal briefs and descriptions of things that include EV charging. It's worth going on their site and just doing a search for some terms around EV charging, or actually anything about strata title. And finally, Natural Resources Canada, they had quite a big, robust rebate program that we applied for. But unlike hydro, the application for the NRC was a little bigger. Our application was 43 pages long. And in the end, after all that, we apparently didn't qualify for their rebate. But nonetheless, they do have a program that's worth looking into.